Michael Caparelli, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be on.
And of course, Vic Ferrari, welcome back to the show.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Going good. Tell you what, let's start out with you guys introducing yourselves. Michael, why don't you start us out?
Yes, I'm Mike Caparelli. I'm from Providence, Rhode Island. If you're not familiar with the geography, about an hour from Boston, 2 hours and 20 minutes from New York City. Grew up in Providence. I spent 16 years pastoring a church within the city, dealing with a lot of people that were released from prison, even doing ministry within the prison. So lots of experience with inmates. Actually, my experience with inmates goes back to being a kid. My dad was incarcerated. My mother would take me to visit him. The euphemism in Italian American families, his dad went away to college. So I
That's true.
remember visiting him, and it's funny. Here I am in my mid 40s, and my dad, he's almost 70, and he refers back to his days in college. I'm like, Dad, we're over this now. You were not in college. But I had a compassion for people in prison at a young age. Ended up in juvenile detention myself at 17. I was a very troubled kid. Was going down the same road as my dad, and then embraced the faith in Jesus Christ that changed my whole life. When I left the juvenile detention, I never got in trouble again. Pursued higher education along the way. After 16 years of pastoring, I had finished my PhD, which took about 8 years of full-time college in addition to the bachelor's and the master's, between the coursework and the dissertation, the research, and decided to resign from pastoring. I'd suffered 2 heart attacks, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
Minor heart attack at 40, the widowmaker at 43. I was
Yikes.
I was boxing and hit the ground, and the guy I was with called the ambulance. They came, they put 4 stents in me, and decided the pastoring was just too stressful at that point. And I had colleges interested in me teaching because I had the higher education, the doctorate in behavioral science. So this decided to start teaching. Lots of opportunities opened up in schools, prisons, churches. In fact, right now I speak in 50 venues a year on mental health. I've been in 18 states in the last 1 year, speaking on depression, anxiety, antisocial personality disorder, grief, anger management. I mean, the subjects are endless. In the process, wrote a few books on mental health from a faith-based perspective, because I am a Christian. And I mailed one of those books to David Berkowitz. I mailed him that book in 2021, and he read it pretty quickly, wrote me back, and said, I'd love to meet you. He said, based on your book, you're the kind of guy I'm looking for to tell my story. You have an understanding of the psychological because of your higher education, and you share the Christian Judeo worldview. David, as we know, is a Christian, has been one for 35 years. So I met with David, first visit, April 1st, 2022. It was in the middle of what the prison considered to be COVID.
Yeah.
We had to wear masks. And that began one session out of 34 sessions, 100 hours of analyzing David Berkowitz, talking about the crimes, the mental health factors behind the crimes, as well as his life behind bars over the last 46 years. And just released a book on these sessions called Monster Mirror. The book came out in October, and the first week of its release, it ranked the #1 new release in the true crime category on Amazon. And I'm blessed to say that it has sold thousands since October, and has opened up a lot of doors. I've been on national syndicated talk shows. We've gone into the prison and interviewed David with a video crew. The interview will be featured on Michael Francese's YouTube channel. If you don't know him, he was an underboss in the Colombo crime family, who's now a Christian, and he has a show, and he's been a friend of mine for a while. He wrote the foreword to the book, and you'll see that interview on his channel.
Wow. Excellent. Vic, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Vic Ferrari. I'm a Bronx kid. I'm a retired 20-year member of the New York City Police Department. I worked in a lot of different units, specifically my last 10. I was a detective in organized crime in the NYPD's auto crime division. So anything with chop shops, exporting stolen vehicles out of the country, that was my gig. I retired in 2007. I got into writing, and I've written a series of behind the scenes books about the New York City Police Department. And I just started a podcast called NYPD Through the Looking Glass, which I bring on retired NYPD members to share their experiences.
Very good. Yeah, I obviously, Mike is here because of his experience with David Berkowitz, and Vic is here because I wanted an NYPD, slant on this. And who better but an NYPD detective who has a podcast that's used to doing this kind of thing. So this is working out good. But I wanted to start out with an overview of New York City in the late 70s. The city was either on the verge of bankruptcy, or did they go bankrupt? I can't remember.
They asked Gerald Ford for money. I remember it was in the front page of the Daily News. It said Ford to New York drop dead. So they were close. I don't know if they went into bankruptcy, but they did. I remember them asking that was actually his undoings, and it was in all the papers. So they were financially strapped.
Yeah, and crime was completely out of control, or at least it felt like it was out of control. There was some record-breaking like violent crime statistics. It was really bad. And if I remember correctly, they were laying off cops and firefighters.
They did. I think it was in 74. I'm gonna get the dates wrong, but they did. For a while, they
Yeah.
laid off a bunch of cops, and then about a year and a half later, 2 years later, they started hiring them back. And that kind of caused problems because there was a mass hiring thing going on, and they really didn't scrutinize who they were hiring.
Oh boy.
So they let a lot of bad apples in with that, and then they had to weed them out.
Yeah, weird how less cops equals more crime. I don't know. I'm not, like a doctor or anything, or an expert, but dang, and then, more cops come in and that helps with crime control. Weird. It's so ironic. But anyways, again, New York was out of control, had all kinds of problems. There was a blackout where you lost power for, I think it was 26 hours, something like that. And that just was like pouring gasoline on the fire. It was in the middle of summertime. Tensions were high, and then before you know it, there's all kinds of riots, looting. Over 500 cops got hurt. I don't know how many people got killed. It was just something like out of a movie.
Yeah, New York was out of control. It wasn't just the riot. I think it was 77. It was just, I mean, the whole time period. New York goes in phases. Back then you had Ed Koch. Ed Koch was a good mayor. He was soft on crime. He liked cops, but he was soft on crime. And then from him, we went to the late great David Dinkins, who just didn't understand it and ignored it. And New York got worse.
And hope it just goes away, right?
Yeah, and then we got Rudy, and then Rudy was a federal prosecutor. He had decimated the mob with a series of high-profile cases. He got it. He let the cops do their jobs. He increased hiring, and he just let them do their jobs. And then Bloomberg was smart enough to come in, and he kept the same policies.
Yeah. So in 1975, David Berkowitz, also known as the son of Sam, commits his first violent crime. Now, before that, he was a serial arsonist. I mean, I think it's starting from like teenager or preteen, right, Mike?
More like 7 years old.
Oh, 7. I didn't know it was that young.
He started burning his toys on the windowsill,
Okay.
as well as insects on the windowsill of his bedroom on Stratford Avenue in the Bronx. And his mom would find the windowsill charred, ask him, why it was charred. He would pretty much say he wasn't aware that it was charred. He hid the fact that he was lighting his toys and bugs on fire.
Wow. So, I'll back up a little bit with David Berkowitz. He was given up for adoption from his birth mother. What was the story behind that? Why did she give up her child?
Betty Broda was a young lady living in Brooklyn, and she was having an extramarital affair with a guy by the name of Joseph Kleinman. He was married, and he didn't want her to have the baby. It would have been a big scandal. He had a family of his own. So he insisted that she give David up for adoption. The pregnancy was very tumultuous. There was actually fistfights between the two. She wanted the baby, and Joseph wanted her to give it up. And she acquiesced to his wishes, knowing that he was her financial supply. So at 4 days old, right on the stoop of Brooklyn Hospital. Back then, this is 1950, what, 19, early 1950s, 1952.
Hmm.
David's 71 this year. So without any type of legal, protocol, she handed baby Richard David was his name, his birth name, handed Richard David over to the Berkowitz family, Nat and Pearl, and they took him home from the Brooklyn hospital to the Bronx where they lived, and they raised him in the Bronx.
Now, he had a relatively quote unquote normal childhood, correct?
Well, not, I mean, David was from the gate, from the very beginning. I mean, even from the drive from Brooklyn Hospital to the Bronx, uh, David said that his parents told him that he was inconsolable. I mean, he just cried. It was almost as if that bond between him and his mother, because let's face it, a baby and a mother bond in the womb. We
Sure.
tend to think that learning starts in a classroom somewhere, but it doesn't. Prenatal programming and the science behind that is very well documented. I mean, I do lectures in the college on that.
Hmm.
So adoption, even when it's at 4 days old, it is a bond that's been severed. It's the severance of a bond. And it's no surprise that serial killers are 16 times more likely to have been adopted than the general population. That's not to suggest that all adoptees are going to become serial killers, by no
Right.
means. But it has to be recognized as a trauma that the mind might not remember because the mind hasn't developed, but the central nervous system never forgets. So David was a very hard to handle child, was not easy to bond with. His parents spared no effort in lavishing him with affection. I mean, they tried everything they could. They were two good people. But they said from the beginning, it was like trying to stick a piece of tape on a wet surface. The love just wouldn't stick.
Hmm.
And David really put them through a very difficult time all through his childhood.
He was an only child, correct? He had no
Correct.
siblings. Yeah.
Yeah, which
From
really
from the
was a
Berkowitzes. From the
yeah,
Berkowitz.
I mean, that was an anomalous circumstance in the Bronx. In his neighborhood, in the Soundview section, all his friends had siblings. So David would go back home, and he actually said from a young age he felt so lonely. He wanted a sister or a brother. Everybody had siblings back then, big families, and the Berkowitzes weren't able to have children. Pearl had went through some type of cancer treatment
Hmm.
years before she adopted David, and it left her womb barren, and so he had no siblings.
So, I mean, he didn't, his beginnings were tough, but he had a loving adoptive parents.
Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
parents themselves were excellent,
Yes.
but there were factors. I mean, trauma is not just related to parents. There
Right.
were other factors. I spent 100 hours with him, really trying to put the pieces together.
Yeah.
In my book Monster Mirror, which you can get on Amazon, uh, I list 9 factors. I call it the recipe for violence. You really can't blame one thing. I mean, when we try to explain human behavior, one of the most common traps is something known as causal reductionism. When you take a complex phenomenon and you try to boil it down to one single factor, we're lazy intellectually. So that's very appealing to us to say, what was it that caused this? But blaming one factor would be as ludicrous as blaming the last block in the game of Jenga for the collapse of the tower. It's not
Yeah.
the last block, it's the buildup of blocks.
Right.
So talk about those blocks and the buildup that led to the collapse of David Berkowitz.
Gotcha. And being a cop for 25 years, and you know this too, Vic, you have different, like captains and chiefs that come and go, and they all have their own little theories. And then, you start going into, is it causation or is it correlation, for these crimes and these criminals, and and from what I have found, and I've interviewed other people who are a lot smarter than I am when it comes to this, and it's pretty much, it's a mix of stuff and they still really don't know. There's no definitive X, X plus X equals Z or something like that. It just happens sometimes. And yeah, it just
Yeah,
happens.
well, and I would even go further and say it doesn't just happen. David happened.
You're right.
So David made choices. He came to certain intersections, and he owns it. I mean, he talks about that in the book. He made decisions, and when we make decisions, decisions make us. There's an evolution. We evolve into someone that we would never expect to become
Right.
that person. And so we talk about those intersections in the book. You're right. There are other people with the same background, same trauma factors that don't become serial killers. But probably at those intersections, they chose a different path. So it didn't just happen. David happened.
Right. And as far as David goes, he joined he went to high school, obviously. Then he joined the army right out of high school, right?
Correct. He was one of the
Yeah.
few patriots at Columbus High School in the Bronx. Because you're figuring this is late 60s.
Yeah,
This
it's
is
Vietnam era, right?
Vietnam era, a lot of
Yeah.
hippies at Columbus High School, but he was part of a small faction of people that was very patriotic and wanted to join the military and defend his country, which the day Columbus High School met for graduation in his senior year was the day that he was signing the papers to enlist in the military with his dad.
Wow. Yeah, he joined the army, but he didn't see combat. He wanted to, but he didn't see it.
Correct. Yeah, it was pretty counterintuitive. He was expecting to join, be in the middle of a battlefield in Vietnam, and he ends up in a year and a half in Kentucky, and then he's a year and a half in South Korea.
Yeah, he was in Korea. Yeah.
Very monotonous. It's not what he envisioned in his mind. So it was 3 years in the military.
Right. And he gets out and he gets a job with the post office.
Not right away.
Not right away. Okay.
No, post office comes a little bit later. He has a series of jobs before the post office.
Mm,
He drives a taxi in Co-op City. He also was a security guard in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So he had a couple of different jobs. The
okay.
final job, the time pretty much when the Son of Sam massacre was taking place, most of that time was while he was working at the post office.
Okay. So we'll start out with his violence spree. And, we were talking before we started recording that he actually stabbed a woman in 1975. That's how,
Christmas Eve, 1975.
okay. Now, what were the circumstances behind that?
Well, David was a ticking time bomb. And, it's like I said, it was a buildup of factors.
Right.
It's very difficult for him to talk about the crimes per se, although he said a lot more to me than he ever planned on saying, and it's recorded in the book. When David talks about the crimes, and this is not an overstatement or embellishment at all. It looks like he's deadlifting 300 pounds. There's a vein that protrudes across his
Hmm.
forehead. His eyes immediately fill up with tears. I don't mean crocodile tears. And he himself is traumatized by what his own hands did, which is not unusual, not for someone like him whose conscience has really become sensitized over the last 35 years. Now, that conscience was not active during the
Right.
times,
Right.
but certainly over the last 35 years. He talks about that particular time leading to December 24th, 1975, as being in a very delusional state of mind. He does consider it a demonic spell, but not at the expense of free will, not like the devil made me do it. More of an interplay between his own resentments, his own inner rage that was building for a long time, his own letdowns, lots of letdowns, his own shame, his own feeling like an outsider and wanting to be sort of seen and noticed. Those factors mix with what he believes was a diabolical energy. And I know that that's hard for people to understand in America because we're very rationalists. But 2/3 of the world still believes in a demonic realm. Let's face it, we may not be of the persuasion of the supernatural, but we're leading the way in human trafficking, mental health issues. Though we think we have all the answers, I think we really need to look at the stats because America is in trouble. We're in a serious mental health crisis, and maybe there's more than just the rational.
Yeah, I agree without a doubt. So most of his victims were like a man and a woman, younger, and they were gonna make out or they were making out. And the girl that he stabbed, was she just like walking down the street, or what were the circumstances? Do you know?
Correct. It was at night. She was walking down the street. He approached her from behind, stabbed her. The stabbing to him was so traumatic that he ran. Thank God she lived. And he had decided from that point, if it was going to continue, It wasn't going to be with a knife. Even in David's worst state, I wouldn't consider him a sadist. A sadist is going to really enjoy the process of the killing. A sadist would be more like a Ted Bundy.
Hmm.
David, as you can see, I'd put him probably more in the category of a mass shooter, a mass murderer than a serial killer because it's hit and run. It's not spend intimate time enjoying the process of, terrorizing someone.
Right.
The fact that he changed quickly from a knife to a gun. By the way, I'm not at all downplaying the murders. Murder is murder. I'm just trying to explain a little bit the psychology of this. The fact that he went from a knife to a gun is indicative of the fact that he was not your typical sadist killer. It wasn't so much about the reward of what he was doing. It was more about the relief of the rage and the pressure that he felt and the urges that he wrestled with.
See,
More
as a
relief
cop,
than reward.
yeah, as a cop, that's so unusual because usually when you would have a stabbing victim, a shooting victim, they knew the suspect. Like jealousy, greed, name the reasons why, that's usually what happens. Or it's like a botched armed robbery, or it's an attempted rape or something like that. Usually, you don't have some person with a knife just stabbing random people. I mean, does it happen? Yes, but it's very unusual. And it's obviously for the cops, it's very concerning because it's really difficult to try and track down a suspect for something like that. It's like,
Absolutely.
okay, jealous husband. Okay, yeah, I can find that guy, no problem. But this is in a totally different ballpark.
Mm. Well, what we're seeing now, I mean, there are 13 mass shootings a week in the United States of America. That includes obviously mall shootings, school shootings. That's a stat that has just grown exponentially since the 1970s. David, in an odd sense, was the first fruits of something that at that time might have been an anomaly, but we're seeing it more prevalent now. That there's this buildup of rage within our culture, and probably one of the common denominators between a lot of these killings is this outsider mentality. Wanting to be seen, heard, noticed, feeling like I'm on the fringes of
Mm,
society. I mean, David even says that in the letters that he leaves at the crime scenes. I am an outsider watching the world go by, programmed to kill. I mean, the language of the letters is a pretty good indication of exactly the psychology behind the crimes and what you see with Dylan Klebold, Eric Harris, so many of the different mass shootings. He seems to be the first fruits of what we see more prevalent today in 2024.
okay. So the shooting starts in July of 76, and he winds up getting arrested in August of 77. He wound up killing 6 people and wounding 7. And like we alluded to earlier, he graduated from a knife to a 44 Magnum pistol. It was a revolver.
44 caliber
40,
bulldog.
yeah, 44 caliber. And he was dubbed the 44 caliber killer before he
Mm.
was known as the Son of Sam. And just that choice in gun, that's gonna cause probably the most amount of damage for a pistol. A 44 Magnum is a powerful, that's a Dirty Harry gun. That is a huge, back then, that's probably the biggest you could get or close to it.
Most definitely. I mean, the idea of the 44 caliber had come from the movie Taxi Driver.
Mm,
That's the exact gun that's mentioned in a scene between Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese inside the taxi cab when Scorsese plays a deranged husband ready to kill his wife who's cheating on him. That's the gun that's referenced. And in David's mind, it was a gun that would make sure that the job was finished. And in some sense, as strange as this sounds, I know it's going to sound strange to some of the listeners. It's sort of in his mind, it's justified as a mercy killing because I'm putting the person out of their misery. I'm not leaving them to suffer. I'm going to make sure the job is done. Now, of course, he failed in accomplishing that, thank God. But that's part of the thought process going through his mind.
but he was targeting women of a younger age, like in their early 20s, correct? And
Well, I would put a pause on that. I know that
okay,
that's been the popular theory is that he was after women and it was a misogynist deal.
yeah,
David hated everybody.
okay,
I mean, listen, go back to I have behind me on these shelves, I had 1,600 documents I have access to, prison reports, psychiatric reports, arrest records, letters between him and people outside of the prison, inside prison. David hated everybody. I mean, he didn't just kill women, he didn't just shoot women, he also shot men. It was pretty much people that were in vulnerable positions. But if you look at his tirades against some of his neighbors, these were males. Even his tirades against teachers in elementary school. I mean, he got to a fist fight with, I don't know, his third or fourth grade teacher who was a male.
Hmm.
David had more of a war that he believed, again, was partly satanically driven and then partly a very angry, twisted kid, a war against the world.
Okay, because you hear that it was women. I think it was brunettes. Of a
Yeah, I mean,
certain
it fits in with the Freudian
right.
perspective and it fits neatly in that little package, but
But people are
I would challenge that a little bit.
yeah, at
Yeah, but
first,
Stacey Moskowitz was a blonde, right? I mean,
yeah,
Stacey
that's
was a
what
blunt.
was, and
Yeah,
I think her last words to her mom was, don't worry, I'm not the type that, the son of Sam was going after.
correct. Very sad.
Very sad.
Do you think it was more like he was inadequate and he sees young guys with women in cars and he just doesn't know how to approach women or have a relationship with a woman, and he says that should be me. I should be in that car with that chick, making out, putting my hands on her, and I can't. So I'm just going to destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that that's part of the psychology of it. I mean, he definitely spoke of, continually being part of groups from the time he was a kid. It's not like, by the way, he's grown up in New York City, this most populated city in the country. So he's not, when we say he's a loner, he's not the Ted Kaczynski in a cabin with the shaggy beard in the woods somewhere. He plays on baseball teams. He's a part of the Appalachian Mountain Club, which is a group of teenagers that get on a bus and they go up to the gunks and they climb the mountains. He's a part of the military, but he always feels like I'm on the outside. I don't know how to relate
Hmm.
like others. I want to bond, but I don't know how. One of his favorite songs he would listen to continually was the Beatles' Long and Windy Road. This idea that I get right to a door, but I can't step through it. And he definitely has a frustration there when he sees human beings in general relate, have fun, communicate, and he feels so inadequate. That's a good word he's using because there was a lot of shame involved in his story, and there were a lot of shaming incidences throughout his childhood. This shame was definitely part of the psychology behind the crimes.
Yeah, so the shooting started, and at first the police really were befuddled because, like I said earlier, a lot of homicides you can solve because you have a very viable suspect, like the angry husband, the scorn, wife, or you cheated me out of X amount of money, or it's a dope deal gone bad. I mean, you can figure this stuff out. So at first, the NYPD weren't connecting the dots, and then finally they did, and this turned into one of the biggest manhunts for the NYPD. Vic, how do you coordinate something like that? I mean, what would that look like?
I think one of the reasons why they weren't up to speed with it, New York back then was averaging between 2,000 and 2,500 homicides a year. It's a
Wow.
lot of homicides spread out across
Yeah,
the
it
five
sure
boroughs.
is.
And a detective squad, a precinct detective squad, you're catching everything. You're catching bad checks. You're catching domestic violence thing. I mean, it's just nonstop. So yes, each borough has a homicide unit. They come in and supplement the detectives. And if the detectives don't have a suspect within a certain amount of days, then the homicide now is working it with you.
Mm.
Also, you got to remember back then, this is before the Comstat era now. No one was really sharing information, unfortunately, and you had a lot of dead wood in different places. Comstat kind of, bringing people together every week and what are you doing here and what's going on here and doesn't this look like a pattern? They weren't doing that back then. So that's kind of how he was able to pull off these homicides in different boroughs. No one was talking to each other. As crazy as that sounds today with communication and
Oh yeah.
technology. So when they finally did put it together and they started throwing these task forces together, I mean, I've never been on anything like that before, but I've been on a couple of things where, and it's actually, it's from a law enforcement angle, it's cool because now you're put with upper echelon detectives, or supposed to be, and now they're giving you the resources and the overtime and the equipment. And, from what I've seen in documentaries, I mean, I think it was the largest manhunt in New York City history.
Yeah, I would not doubt that without a doubt. And this went on for a year, a little more than a year, actually. And New York was kind of getting hysterical. They're like, hey, this crazy guy is out here shooting. Most of the victims were female, and again, there was the thought of, was like, oh God, I can't be a brunette. Women were actually dyeing their hair.
My aunt did that.
Really? Do you have
Yeah,
any
my
other
aunt cut her
stories,
hair
Vic, of
short.
like,
My aunt was a long brunette. She cut her hair short and dyed it. You couldn't get away from it. You got to remember, like New York back then, cable really hadn't made its inroads to the Bronx. I mean, maybe there was, but we didn't have it. You only had a certain amount of news stations, and it was in the paper every day, and it was running. I mean, you couldn't get it. You got to be deaf and blind not to know what was going on in New York City with the Son of Sam case back then. It was everywhere.
wow? So, and at the very end, how he got caught was a parking ticket. That was like the big breakthrough. Could you explain that, either Michael or Vic, either one?
Well, go ahead, Michael. Michael, you talked to David.
Yeah.
So what's
Yeah.
his take on it?
Yeah. I'd be interested
Well,
in that.
throughout the entire killing spree, David had many moments where he actually had the phone in his hands. He had the phone number written on a piece of paper to call in and say, I'm the son of Sam. I live at 35 Pine Street, Yonkers. There was a part of him that wanted to get caught. Now, if you know David, he's a very meticulous personality. The idea of David Berkowitz parking in front of a fire hydrant and it being a mishap, it doesn't reconcile well with his meticulous type A personality. I do believe from David's own statements to me, there was a subconscious desire to get caught. So he parks in front of the fire hydrant in Brooklyn. It's around midnight, a little later than that. And within that vicinity in Brooklyn, Bath, Brooklyn, he, spots Stacy and this other fellow and Robert Violante. And he ends up, shooting Stacy, killing Stacy. Robert survives. And then later on, the police say, you know what? They come up with an idea. I think it was like a day later. Why don't we look at the parking tickets in that area and see if somebody, there was about 20 to 25 parking tickets that was slapped on windshields. Don't quote me on that number, but I think it was somewhere around there. And they say, let's just, check out who was in the area, who might have seen something. And then one of the tickets catches them by surprise. What is this guy from Yonkers, Jewish, doing in Brooklyn? I believe an Italian neighborhood. And what is he doing in Italian? New York is obviously, as you know, detective, it's a diverse city. I mean, I was raised by a guy from the Bronx. It's a diverse city, but it's very pigeonholed at that time. I mean, the Italians stayed the Italians, the Jews stayed with the Jews.
Yep.
It's more of a melding now. But what's he doing here at midnight? So now he goes from being a potential witness to a potential suspect. And the NYPD calls the Yonkers Police Department. And ironically, the dispatcher is a woman who lived next door to him, or at least her father lived next door to him, Sam Carr. And she says, I know this guy. And he has been nothing but a harassment to my family, to other neighbors. He shot my father's dog. And right away they think, wow, this is gonna be the guy. And they zero in on David Berkowitz.
The story I heard about the summons is they were already doing that. Like any night there was a shooting, they would go into the two precincts, or if they were bordering precincts, and they would pull those summonses. The story I was told was the night of that, one of the cops went on vacation or took a couple of days off and just left the summonses in his locker. So it took a while.
Oh, wow.
And then, now I don't know how true it is, but that's the
Yeah.
story I heard within the NYPD.
Well, it couldn't have been too long of a while, because the night of the shooting and the arrest, is only a couple of days. It's only a few days.
Okay, maybe it took in a day off or something.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I think the shooting was like end of July, and he's arrested in the beginning of August. It might have been maybe a week tops, but
okay.
it wasn't a long period of time between the 2 days.
Yeah, for those who are not in the know, back then, I mean, everything's digital now. You know, cops giving out tickets, they spit them out of a printer in their squad car, or if it's a civilian parking checker, they have like this little gun that just spits out the ticket. You know, everything's digital and computerized. Back then, we hand wrote our tickets and there was carbon built in. So there'd be a hard copy that you'd put on somebody's windshield, and then you would have your own copy that it was in your ticket book. And when you were done with your tour at 8 o'clock in the morning, I worked late shifts. So if it wasn't super busy, they expected you to write non in the city of Milwaukee, you had to have a permit to park on the street between 2 a.m., 6 a.m. And there was even and odd nights. You had to, park on the even side, whatever. And if there wasn't a whole lot going on, they expected you to write some tickets. It's just the way it was. And more than one homicide that I was involved in got solved by writing tickets. It's like, okay, it's like, hey, let's find this guy. It's like, okay, where does he hang out? Okay, he hangs out at that drug house because he's gotten 5 tickets in the last 6 months in front of this dope house. I mean, it's amazing how that stuff works.
We used to find people, we would do summons checks. There was a system where we could go into the system with a license plate and find out where they were getting parking tickets.
Yep. We had the
So a
same
lot
thing.
of times if I was looking for a car or something and I would find out that they're parking around Coney Island in Brooklyn, it would kind of put me in the ballpark of where to start looking for this guy or this vehicle.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And what people don't understand too is you see on TV where, say, you got a homicide and you have the cops or detectives doing a neighborhood canvas where they're knocking on doors, hey, did you see anything, hear anything, et cetera, et cetera. But we would also do a vehicle canvas where we would take the plates and the VINs off of all the cars in the area, because sometimes, somebody kills somebody and they're beating feet and, they get spooked and they leave their car behind. And it's like, okay, the 3300 block of North 12th Street has this, Oldsmobile that belongs on the south side. Why is it here? It's out of place when every other car on that block, belongs on that block. So it comes down to just old fashioned, very tedious police work. And it usually solves a lot of crimes. So park a ticket did him in. Now, Mike, what was your first impression of David during your first and last meeting with him? And how many meetings did you have with him?
I met with David 34 times for the analysis. Now, I've met with him about 5 or 6 times after that. I still keep in touch with him. We probably talk on the phone once a week, and we email maybe once or twice a week. Because again, for me, it's not just the subject of a study. For me, being a minister, I take a personal interest in these guys. And that might not sit right with some people. Like, how could you be friends with this guy? Well, I believe in Christ. He was a friend of the sinners, and he needs somebody there for him. So for me, it went beyond just the 34 sessions. It's actually the longest analysis ever done. David Abrahamson, a criminologist in the 80s, who actually testified in David's pre-sentencing hearings. David never went on trial. Met with him for 50 hours and wrote a book called The Confessions of the Son of Sam. I met with him for 100. My first session, I show up and I was surprised probably by how energetic he is. I mean, usually a guy, a lifer who's been in for 46
Yeah,
years,
you're not.
you just lose motivation. You become very institutionalized, kind of like a lump on a log.
Sure.
I mean, I've dealt with other inmates. This is actually the third serial killer that I've worked with. And so I'm expecting this kind of like lethargic individual. And I don't know anybody more productive and busy. And even I'm talking people in free society that I know than David Berkowitz. So he comes in the room and he's just full of energy. We sit down and, it took a while to build a rapport and to really get to some of the things he wanted to say to me. He had to size me up, which is completely understandable. He's had many people burn him through the years.
Sure.
And
What was your first impression of him, though? You meet face to face. What was the first thought like in your head?
intelligent,
Okay.
articulate, introspective, very self-reflective, um, careful, very careful with his words, takes his time to speak. You won't catch him with some long stream of consciousness where he's rambling. Very careful with his words. He's going to tell you exactly what he wants to tell you. His tongue is not going to get ahead of him,
Yeah.
but full of energy, you
N-
know.
Now
And
let
I found the more trust built, the more candid he
okay.
became because he wanted to get some things off his chest.
That makes sense. To set the stage for our listeners, obviously you weren't in his cell. Was this like in a common room? Was he shackled? Were other people around? Did you record this? I mean, how did you take notes? I mean, what did it look like?
Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't. It was there were a couple of different locations. One location was private, where there were two guards at the door, and we did videotape with Michael Frances, in that particular room. And then other sessions were in the visiting room, but him and I had some space. It's not that crammed, but there were you could see other inmates meeting with the girlfriend or meeting with the wife, the mother, what have you.
Yeah.
Um, no recordings. The only recording was with Michael Frances, and that took a lot of protocol, a lot of special permission. So, to do that every week with a recording, so we're just taking notes with a recording every week, that would require, all the hoops we had to jump through for like 3 months.
So you
And what
were
I would
there.
do is at the end of the visit, I would take the notes, and within a couple of days, I would have him look at them, review
Hmm.
to make sure that I'm getting this right. I mean, that's just part of good research. Is
So he had access to email then? You're saying that you were emailing.
Yeah, he can't get online like you and I can get online. There's a liaison
Hmm.
between him and the outside world. It's called PayPal, and no, not PayPal. It's called JPay.
JPay. Okay.
JPay, yeah. Anybody that's written to prisoners or email prisoners, they know about JPay. It's pretty it's not just David Berkowitz, it's in Florida, it's in a bunch of states.
Hmm.
But you send the email to JPay and they send it to David and vice versa. And it's usually a 48-hour turnaround. Sometimes it comes quick. Sometimes it comes within a day. But I would email him the notes, email him the statements he made, get him to review it, make sure that I got this right. And so it was a lot. It was very, very intensive study. I mean, I immersed myself in that analysis for I don't know, a year and a half that we went at it between April 1st, 2022 to September 2023. And then the book was released a month and a half later. I was writing along the way the book while at the same time collecting the data and interpreting it.
Now, when you first started this project, what exactly was it for? Did you know that you were going to write a book, or what did that look like? I mean, you said that I think you mailed him a book, and he got in contact with you, and he wanted to talk to you. I mean, why?
Yeah, so you have to understand my vocation. I'm a PhD, advanced studies in human behavior. I teach at a couple of different colleges, psychology, abnormal psych, criminal psych, social psych. I travel across the country. I'm in all sorts of venues. You can go on my website and see. I've been in 18 states in the last year and speak on mental health. So mental health is a real passion for me. And we have a mental health crisis in our nation. I mean, we're leading the way with depression, violence, you name it. So trying to understand David Berkowitz ties into that bigger picture, trying to understand what he did, why he did it, and his transformation in order to give hope to those young people that are at the cusp of destruction, putting a book together that would, shed some light on the precipitating factors, also bring hope that transformation is possible. That was really the impetus, the goal, the drive behind meeting with David. I had mailed him a copy of a book I wrote previously. I wrote 4 other books. The 4 other books, sold a few thousand. They do anywhere near as well as this book. But I mailed him a particular book and about mental health, and he read it. And he also has this same passion. I mean, he writes back and forth with suicidal teenagers around the world. His mail like the mail he gets on a weekly basis, is off the charts. So we wrote this book with the intention of really speaking to those that are reading it and that are in a dark place in their head. That was the goal behind meeting with him.
Now, did you have a book when you first started meeting with him? Did you have the intention of writing this book about him?
Yeah, by the time I
Okay.
arrived at that first session, we had already corresponded a few times
Hmm.
in letters. So in the correspondence, you know, we both kind of agreed that wouldn't it be great to put his story in print?
Okay.
And he had been waiting for that. He had had other people write the book, write books about him, but either the books took this, very dark turn, and it was all about sort of feeding that appetite in our culture for bloodshed, or it took the more like Christian cheesy, turn where it was sort of like Velveeta cheese, like now I love Jesus, but there really wasn't any understanding of the psyche. The fact that I had both qualifications put me in this position where he said, you'd be the right guy to tell the story, to really speak to the mental health crisis in our nation and why we're seeing 13 mass shootings a week in the United States. David can relate to a lot of those people that have committed those mass shootings. In fact, the guy that killed 4 on the campus 2 years ago, the college campus killer, was it Utah? Brian Kohlberger wrote David Berkowitz a letter. I wrote him 2 letters. So he gets letters from these types of people all the time. Some of them are reaching out for help. And I'll tell you, I've got some of the letters behind me. He's done his best to try to help those that are in that dark place that he was in the 70s.
Yeah. We alluded to this earlier, talking about like demonic possession, what was possessing David Berkowitz. Do you believe in demons?
I do.
Okay.
It's again, it's one of those subjects that seems antiquated. It seems like it's horse and buggy. Like, where aren't we, haven't we outgrown that?
Right.
And I would challenge rational Americans that 2/3 of the world still believe in demonic possession. It doesn't mean that there's not psychological factors. It doesn't mean that you yourself don't play a role and you're not responsible. David is responsible. He decided to let this in, so to speak. But I want you to think about times in your life when you blow it somehow. Maybe you lose your temper. I mean, we've all had those moments. Whatever you do, you punch a wall, you kick a cat, whatever it is you do. And when you're all done doing what you do, here's the language you use when you apologize to whoever. I'm sorry. I don't know what got into me. What got into you? I don't know what possessed me to do that. What possessed you? I got carried away. Our language insinuates some paranormal reality, some paranormal energy that can sometimes take us further than we ever planned on going. And that almost flies in the face of our character. It's like, I never thought I was capable of that. So I would argue that, yeah, there's a lot of psychological factors behind his crimes. I elaborate on them in the book, but there's also an interplay with a diabolical energy. And David Berkowitz is not the first serial killer to speak of this. Ted Bundy sat with the FBI for 150 hours. And he said that the crimes that he committed, it was like an out of the body experience. He called it the entity, something foreign that came into him. The FBI agents, 2 secularists, they're not like clergymen. They said when Bundy talked about the crimes, that his baby blue eyes mutated into pitch blackness. Dennis Rader called it the X Factor. Jeffrey Dahmer spoke of watching The Exorcist and feeling this demonic energy come over him. So Berkowitz is not the first to speak of demonic possession. He did recant the story in the 70s. He was behind bars in Attica and he was being tortured by the inmates. I mean, they were barking loud from their cells, tormenting him about the demonic possession story. So to stop all the heckling, he did recant his demon possession story, but he's come back to it now in his 70s and does believe in the reality of demons, and so do I.
I mean, one point of view too would be how convenient is it to say that, yeah, I was possessed, there was demons. That's why I did these horrible things.
What makes that convenient?
It's an excuse. It's an excuse.
Well, I mean, isn't anything we say could be
it could be, but I'm just saying that I mean, I'm not saying yes or no to
Could
this.
mental health be an excuse?
No. Oh yeah. I mean, it could be a part of it. But what I'm
Yes.
saying,
Anything we say could be considered an excuse,
right.
right?
But what I'm saying is it's just convenient for someone that's done a horrible thing and knows that they're going to prison and their only chance of parole is, it's like, okay, I got to come up with something. I'm not saying this is the case, but isn't that kind of convenient for that?
I guess it could be.
It could be.
But in
I'm just
David's,
saying.
yeah, in David's context, it doesn't fit what you're saying
Okay.
because he's not looking to get out. In fact, he blew off over half his parole hearings, and he
Hmm.
goes on parole every 2 years. But then it was perceived as arrogance by the family of victims, so
Yeah.
he decided to show up. But he's not looking to get out. I mean, this is not a pitch to try to get out. In fact, how successful of a pitch would it be to a parole board to get out that I was possessed by the devil? I mean, it doesn't sound like a very persuasive pitch to me if I was on a parole committee. So I don't know if that logic flies. I think there's a difference between an excuse and an explanation.
Hmm.
An
Vic, you look like you
excuse,
have something to say.
Yeah, I had a question for Michael because he spent so much time with him.
yeah,
Early on, Berkowitz talked to that journalist Maury Terry. Was he pulling his chain as far as going on with the Carr brothers being involved in this cult, and there were more people involved, or has he recanted that? Because early on, he said that I can't talk about it because it hurt my family. It's like, well, his family is long gone. I'm just kind of curious, is he still going with that, or is there something to that, or you're able to get out of him about that?
that's probably one of the most interesting chapters of the book because after spending a lot of time with David Berkowitz, um, he opened up to me about the fact that he lied to Maury Terry and he did commit these killings alone. Now, there was a cult. I mean, it's pretty established. Yonkers, Untermeyer Park, the history of cults. There was a cult. And like true to his background, he did join the cult because he always wanted to be a part of groups, but he was on the fringes of the group. I mean, their language of, wanting to create chaos in the city as cults do definitely played a role in influencing his psychology. But the killings were maverick behavior. He was out on his own doing it, maybe partly to impress that group of people. But they were there sort of in the background of his psyche, but they were not part of the shootings themselves. And he admits, I don't say this on every podcast, but the book has been selling more and more.
Right.
But I've said in other podcasts, I'm not going to say, but at this point, it's gotten so
Yeah,
viral.
the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, cat's out of the bag. In fact, we met with Carl Denaro. Carl Denaro, good guy, Carl, but Carl is of the belief that David didn't shoot him. And, David and I met with Carl, and David looked at Carl in the face and said, Carl, I'm sorry, I lied. He said, I shot you. And Carl doesn't believe it. And Carl has the right to his opinion. Good guy, totally support Carl, and we're friends. But we agree to disagree in this particular area. Carl has wrote a book on his theory on why he believes it was the involvement of a cult. But that was part of the friendship with David and I. It took some time. Here's a man who had a secret, and and he just become a Christian when he met with Maury Terry. He was young in his faith, and he felt pressure. There was a lot of pressure going on there in the relationship. It's pretty complex, but he lied. And I mean, you can say, well, he lied. You can't believe him ever again. But you know what? Apply that same standard to yourself, because surveys show that about 70% of the people in America can't go 15 minutes without telling a lie. So, lying, that's true. Lying is more second nature than we realize. We want to, David's easy to pick on. He's really easy to pick on. And no doubt he has lied and he has had a problem with that. And I confront him in the book about this. But when it's his opportunity to tell the truth and admit the lie, maybe he didn't do the right thing, but at least he did the right thing after he did the wrong thing. And there's some integrity in that. There's a chapter where he comes out and I call it shocking confessions, and he admits he did it alone.
Let me just ask you two more questions. So one is, were the Carr brothers involved in that cult? And the second question is, now he did it for the attention or something. Why did he plea out? Like, why didn't he drag this through a 3-year trial of doctors and medical experts, because it seemed like when he pled guilty and he was carrying on taunting the Moskowitz family,
Right.
and even when the perp walk, when you seen him, it looked like he was having the time of his life with this. I was always curious, why did he plea out within a year? I mean, he was in upstate New York prison within a year, where he could have just dragged it, like most guys that know they're never going to get out. They're treated better in a city facility as opposed to going upstate. I was just always curious about that, why he just pled out.
Well, if you're going with the perspective that David was having a lot of fun with this, then your question makes sense. But if you're going with the reality of what was happening
Right.
with David in his head, then you can understand why he pled out. He was not having the time of his life. Yeah, he did smirk on the perp walk. What was behind that smirk? I wouldn't doubt there's some cockiness there, but it was really to cover up lots of shame. Cockiness is often a cover up for shame. There was lots of shame, lots of nervousness. The people get nervous, they laugh, they smile.
True.
The police had told him he could get shot on this perp walk. Something could happen. Stay close to me. Lots of nervousness. It was also tinged with some relief. He said, I felt relieved. But make no mistake about it, he wasn't going back to his cell gleefully. Like it was all this euphoric time of bliss. That's just Hollywood movies, and that's not reality to human nature. He didn't want to go through the trial because of the torture and the pain. He had already felt so much of it, so much shame, putting the families through this. And then he was also told by his lawyers, if you plead out and understand he's young, he's naive, you get the chance of parole someday. So he's under the influence of the lawyers. He was also meeting with the minister at the time, a woman by the name of Ali. She was out of Staten Island, I believe. And she was telling him about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he started to feel guilt for what he did and decided, you know what? I'm the man. I own it. And just figured it in his mind, it just seemed to be the easier way to plead out. It didn't seem genuine to go down the road of not guilty by reason of insanity, and decided to plead guilty.
Yeah, that was my next question, is why wouldn't he go for, the insanity defense?
Yeah, for all the reasons I just stated.
Yeah, I
He
mean,
knew it would be a long trial. He knew it would put
right.
his
Yeah.
family through a lot of shame. It would put the victims' families through more pain. It would traumatize himself. And he was told by lawyers, look, cooperate. It's
Yeah,
easier.
because like we'd say Jeffrey Dahmer, I'm from Milwaukee. So,
Mhm.
that's what before Happy Days, this is after Happy Days, now we're known for Jeffrey Dahmer. Before we were known for Happy Days and
Laverne
beer
and Shirley
drinking.
too, right?
Laverne and
Yeah,
Shirley.
Laverne and Shirley. Oh yeah, you betcha. And then Jeffrey Dahmer came in and kind of ruined the whole thing. And he went to trial, not saying that I didn't do these crimes. The entire trial was, I didn't know right from wrong. I was insane at the time of these crimes. That's what the whole
Who's this?
trial was for.
Who's this?
Jeffrey Dahmer.
Oh, okay, because David went to trial, but yeah,
No, Jeffrey Dahmer. That's what it, reminds me. It's like, then I thought to myself, why wouldn't David Berkowitz do the same thing that Jeffrey Dahmer did? It would make more sense. But I tell you what, the Jeffrey Dahmer trial had so many far-ranging ripple effects. I mean, like one of the DAs wound up being a Jesuit priest. He quit being a DA. It was so disturbing to him that he he wound up going to the priesthood. And I have a bunch of other stories that you have all these hardened detectives and cops that we've seen everything. It's not that, but that trial, that series of crimes was so disturbing that a human being could do that to another human being.
We live in a humanistic society, meaning we are under the delusion that mankind is wonderful, that we're just good people. And when these things happen, it's just, we have delusions of goodness. We think, oh, I could never do that. And one of the challenges of my book, I call it Monster Mirror, because this monster is a mirror, is that there's a potentiality for evil in everyone. We tend to think that these killers are other people, but there are no other people. There's only human nature. It's not like there's a separate breed or species. And I think if you study history and you go back, guys like Dr. Jordan Peterson, who I just met last week and went to his lecture and took a picture with him and put a book in his hands. He's a major voice right now in our culture. And I think he's shaking up the humanistic society to say, look back at history. 1940 Germany. If you were a citizen in Germany, I know you like to read history and empathize with the heroes, but the chances are you'd be on the wrong side of history and you'd find yourself doing things that you'd never thought you were capable of doing. So, there's a potentiality for evil inside all of us. And given the right circumstances and the right series of choices, not all at once, not suddenly, but subtly,
Yeah.
we evolve sometimes into things that we never thought we would ever evolve into.
Hmm. Do you believe in criminal profiling?
Yeah, to an extent.
Okay.
I mean, the
Where
criminal
does David
profile,
fall into a profile?
well,
If
he
you're
was,
going to do a criminal profile on
yeah, I
him,
mean,
where would you put
I
him?
think in the 1970s, I think that he was definitely an antisocial personality. He definitely had antisocial personality disorder, which is known in the culture as psychopath. Psychopath is not a clinical term. It's not listed in the DSM as one of the 250 some odd psychological disorders, but it correlates with antisocial personality disorder. Not exact, but it's as close as it gets. Antisocial personality disorder, low empathy, manipulative, exploit people and their weaknesses, not very low ability to, own what you do. I mean, he had that anti-social personality disorder with psychotic breaks. The fact that he had these psychotic breaks, it confused, I think, the psychiatrists at the time. One of them, I think his name was Schwartz, Dr. Schwartz, diagnosed him with schizophrenia. I don't believe David Berkowitz was a schizophrenic committing these crimes as a schizophrenic. I believe he was too calculating to be a schizophrenic. But the fact that he had intermittent psychotic breaks, it could confuse even the best of medical professionals into believing at that time that he was a schizophrenic. So I would say at that time, an antisocial personality disorder with psychotic breaks.
Mm, interesting. Yeah, I interviewed Catherine Ramsland, and she studied the
Oh,
BTK killer. Catherine
oh, okay.
Ramsland.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I
Yes.
interviewed her. Very
Wait.
interesting. And we're talking about criminal profiling, and she said the more we're learning about, or the more we think we're learning about this, the less we really know. We can't pigeonhole people. It's like, oh, that's going to be a serial killer because of, X, Y, and Z. It just we can't think that way anymore.
Well, that's why I say I think we
Yeah,
have to come back to the ancient, timeless presupposition that has been debunked in the last 100 years under humanism that mankind in general is capable of anything and everything. We used to think the serial killer was a certain type. There was
right.
a time when criminal profilers in the late 1800s thought it was physical, and you could tell by the size of a person's cranium if they were violent. And then we evolved and said, no, it's more personality, but look out for the introverts. And then Ted Bundy emerges, and
Yeah.
he's this charismatic, gregarious type.
Yep.
And we're like, whoa, wait a minute, we got to expand the profile a little bit.
Yeah.
But we keep expanding and expanding. We got to come back to the ancient, timeless premise of the Bible, and not just the Bible, but many manuscripts that say, listen, it's in all of us. And providing the right circumstances, a sweet little Catholic nun will hit you in the head with a tire iron.
I got the marks to prove it.
Yeah, so do I. Vic and I both went to Catholic school, so we know all about how. But hey, also I've met some nuns that were pretty
Sure.
much angels. I
Absolutely.
know there's the stereotype, but
I'm just
I
being
had
facetious.
me too. It's like it's fun to poke fun at nuns, but I
Sure.
tell you what, some of them were absolute angels, working in hospitals. Where I've had like life and death situations, and it would take this like little 5 foot nothing nun to make stuff happen. It's amazing the power that they would wield.
Sure.
It just and they were most of them are good. I'll go there. But he was we talked before that he was a serial arsonist. Do you think that had anything to do with this, or was that like a big red flag? Because he was setting fire to his stuff in the house, but then wasn't he in like his like little crew setting fire to like buildings?
Yeah, he set 1,400 fires in his life. In fact, the 1,400 fires were documented in a journal.
Fourteen hundred.
Yeah, approximate. When the FBI arrested him, they went in, not the FBI, the NYPD arrested him. They went into his apartment in Yonkers and they found the diary and it had locations, it had the times of day, and they were able to authenticate that these fires were real. And David was actually the Phantom of the Bronx. He was a serial arsonist who was lighting fires and calling the police or the fire department, the authorities, after the fire to tell them, just lit this building on fire, this vacant lot, this abandoned car. So the Son of Sam and the Phantom of the Bronx, both names in the 70s that were making headlines in the newspaper, were the same
Wow.
person.
You know what? And that I believe it because the Bronx at the time was a target rich environment because you had tons of abandoned buildings in the Bronx. I remember as a rookie cop, 10 years after the Son of Sam in 1987, I'm talking streets that went on for blocks of just 6-story walk-ups that were abandoned and abandoned cars all over the place too in
Oh,
these
okay.
lots, or sometimes they would drive a stolen car in the back of a building. So yeah, it was a target rich environment. It would be nothing for him to set something on fire back then.
Yeah, and how that relates to the killings, I mean, it's the same root, different fruit. It's
Yeah.
this rage inside, and he gets a dopamine rush from lighting the fires, same dopamine rush he's getting from pulling the trigger, and it becomes addictive. Violence can be addictive. I mean, we've got a lot of studies in the literature to back that up. It becomes something addictive. He's classically conditioned that, by lighting this fire or pulling the trigger, it gives me this sense of relief, and he keeps coming back to it. The FBI know that in interviewing arsonists, that there are really usually two motivations. One is sexual, which is not the case with David. There's an orgasm or some kind of sexual release at the lighting of the fire. We'll call it lustful. And the other arsonists are livid. They're angry, and it's an outlet for their rage. And David was the livid type, not the lustful type. And it's similar to the mindset behind the shootings.
Wow. We're talking about, society, et cetera. I am on the cusp of Gen X and baby boomer. Depending on what you look at, I'm Gen X or I'm a baby boomer.
I'm a Gen X.
Yeah, yeah, I'm right there. I'm right there. I never could skateboard very well, but I do like flannel, so my heart's with Gen X. But a lot of us were latchkey kids, compared to right now, there's helicopter parents, and I call them snowplow parents, where they take every obstacle out of the way of their children. But it seems like kids are even more troubled now. There's more violence. There's more kids, with anxiety, depression, and I don't know what the percentages are of kids on psychotropic drugs. That it just seems like it's getting worse and worse the more we try to control or help them.
Well, we know from the data that avoidant behaviors increases anxiety. It doesn't decrease it. And parents, helicopter parents, are really good at insulating their kids from any type of pressure, any type of trigger. And the more you insulate the kid from the triggers and the pressure, very much like your immune system, if you're never exposed to germs,
That makes sense.
you're going to have a very fragile immune system. Same thing with the psyche. If you're constantly avoiding pressure, you're just going to become very fragile and be lacking in resilience. Reminds me of a story I often tell in my psychology classes where a little boy sees a caterpillar trying to push its way through a chrysalis, and he wants to help the caterpillar out because he sees him struggling, and he cuts open the chrysalis with the razor blade, and the caterpillar rolls over on his back and it dies. And an entomologist says you should have never did that because through the struggle, the caterpillar builds his wings to become a butterfly. You just clipped his wings.
Uh-huh.
And moms and dads are clipping wings of their kids everywhere by insulating them, becoming very fragile and not able to deal with reality on reality's terms.
I think we're built for adversity and we need it.
Yeah.
And I think the big difference between the way the three of us grew up, there wasn't electronics for a developing mind. And my parents would tell me, go outside and play and don't come back until the street lights come on.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
we were building forts or throwing fireworks at each other or playing games or getting into trouble. And I got in trouble quite a bit as a kid, and then the police department saved me. But I think these kids nowadays, they spend too much time with phones and tabs, and I don't think that they're getting life skills and education.
Yeah, I agree. I was visiting my mother-in-law with my wife a couple days ago, And I was telling her about my childhood, it's like my buddy that lived behind us, his dad gave him a pair of boxing gloves. So his dad set up like a boxing ring in the backyard. And we'd just go back and just beat the shit out of each other. And just, I thought it was the coolest thing ever. Yeah, I mean, as a kid, it was awesome. We would do that kind of stuff all the time. Yeah, and it just, today, I mean, well, first of all, you'd be scared to death that you're going to get sued. If little Johnny, your kid goes in there and, gives the neighbor kid a good shiner or something like that, of course they're going to be rushing to the emergency room. Of course they're going to say, X, Y, and Z is wrong with them. And, then you're going to be hearing from their attorney. It just is a different world. When you get into a fight or a disagreement, it's like, what would you do at the end? You'd shake hands.
True.
The adult or parent would be like, shake hands. It's like, okay, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to do that. That kind of thing.
So you,
So
you take everything we're saying and, a little rejection, break up with the girlfriend, whatever. I can't handle it. No surprise, 13 mass shootings a week in the United States. That kind of fragile temperament, having to handle reality, and not knowing how to cope with reality, it's going to cause a reaction, a backlash.
yeah, I totally agree with you. It's I don't like the way it's going, but it is going. So when you were meeting with David, at any point did you ever think that he was playing you? That he's just like this master manipulator? Because he's very intelligent.
I mean, of course, being a PhD in behavioral science and being trained in human behavior, I'm paying attention.
Yeah.
I'm not cynical. I don't think that the cynic is wise. I think a cynic is looking for, they're looking for a problem when sometimes there is no problem. So I'm skeptical, but not cynical. I'm
Okay.
going to question things. I got a chance to see not only David's actions. People think actions are a good test of a litmus test of character, but people can put on an act very well. I mean, Shakespeare said
Yep.
the world is a stage. We're all acting to some degree. But what's hard to fake is reactions. So I got a chance to see not just David's actions, I got a chance to see his reactions, actions in real time, actions when he's caught off guard, when things don't go his way, when stuff is unplanned, taken by surprise. I showed up at one session and he had a conflict with an inmate and he was very angry. The inmate said something very degrading. I tell about it in the second chapter of my book. I won't get into too many of the details,
Yeah.
but I got a chance to see David navigate through anger. And that was a real good session for me because I got a chance to see how he would handle anger. Now, you could say, well, he's behind bars. And of course, he's not going to do what he did in Free Society. Listen, the first 10 years of him being behind bars, he's put in the hole for 60 days because he almost kills an inmate. So,
Yeah, slash too.
yeah, he got slashed in the neck. So
Yeah.
he had his outbursts, but even behind bars. And I watched him like a pro navigate through that anger. And rather than externalizing, which people do when they're angry, so it's always outside. It's people, places, things. I
Yeah.
vent. He internalizes and he self-reflects. And we talk about what's really behind the anger because anger is typically a cover-up emotion. It's a secondary response of the brain to masquerade more vulnerable feelings like fear or hurt or shame. And we got a chance to go down a road of introspection. And I walked away from that session saying, this guy has grown tremendously. So I've seen his reactions, not just his actions. And I'm a believer that though I think he should stay behind bars, I'm not arguing for his release, and neither is he. I do think he has experienced some real change and transformation and has worked tremendously on his character in the last 35 years.
Yeah. Going back a little bit, he worked at the post office during this crime spree. Did he ever allude to you that, he was going to go postal and do like a mass shooting at the post office? I know it's very, stereotypical. And I know that also from reading the book that he was very close to going into, was it a nightclub or somewhere
Yeah.
where he was just going to shoot it up?
Yeah, he actually visited the Hamptons, about an hour and a half drive from Yonkers, a couple of days before he was arrested. And he was ready to go on a shootout at the Hamptons. I mean, he had his artillery with him, and it rained. It was an outdoor, it was disco club in the
Oh,
summer. And that rain was really a gift from heaven because people were going to get hurt that night. And went back to his apartment in Yonkers. And then the day he was arrested, he says he was on his way to commit a shootout. He was going to go right back to the Hamptons
wow.
and die in a blaze of fire. Because Son of Sam wasn't just homicidal, it was also suicidal. He was self-destructing. He was trying to destroy himself as well as humanity. You know, the saying misery loves company. Well, in this case, misery demands hostages.
Yeah,
Misery takes prisoners. And he
sure.
was on his way to commit a shootout. And thank God the Yonkers police caught him in time. The NYPD caught him in time right before he went on that shootout.
Yeah. Did you ever say that he had any animosity towards his like postal employees or bosses or anything like that? Nothing
No,
like.
it was a stressful job. He actually built some relationships
Okay.
in the post office. But like all of his relationships, there's a difference between being with people and bonding with people. And David never knew really how to bond
Mm,
well. He always had this secret interior that he kind of kept to himself and kept them, your secrets. Your secrets will separate you from people, even when you're with them and they're in their company. He would walk ladies to their cars at night. They were scared because the son of Sam was at loose.
wow.
And in his mind, he wasn't playing a game. It
Yeah.
was like, you know, uh, he was wrestling. There was a lot of conflict going on in his mind. And maybe in some respect, he's trying to do a good deed to wash away his bad deeds. I mean, while he's hunting for victims in the streets of New York, he has in his trunk an emergency kit in case he sees someone stuck, he can help them. On one particular night in January 1977, while he's hunting for a victim, a couple of ladies are stuck in a snowbank. And sure enough, he stops. He helps, gets his flashlight out, helps pull the car out of the snowbank, wishes them well, gets in his car, and goes looking for a victim.
Wow. That's wow. That's something else. So, do you know if any of his victims or relatives of victims ever attend parole hearings, and does he interact with them at these parole hearings?
No, there's no presence of families of victims at the parole hearings.
There is not. So they can't give like a victim impact statement or anything like that.
Not now. I don't think there was early on, but see, even early on, the parole hearings didn't begin to the 90s.
Hmm.
Uh, I think the involvement of family kind of dwindled. I'm 99% sure that I don't think there was ever a parole hearing in the 10 parole hearings
Okay.
that the presence of families of victims from what David has told me.
All right. Now, I know we kind of touched on this a little bit. Do you see any similarities between David and more like recent serial killers?
Um, Not as much with serial killers as with mass shooters.
Okay.
If think of David's killings as, similar to a mass shooting, like a school shooting, but
Oh, spread out. Okay.
just spread out over time.
Interesting. Okay.
He would hit and run.
Hit and run.
Yeah. Now, I think you were stating that one of the victim's mothers was in contact with him. Were there any other, instances where victims, relatives have reached out to him?
Carl Denaro, who David shot in the head, and Nisa Moskowitz, from what I know, were the only two people connected to the murders that David was in contact with. Nisa, she forgave him, which was absolute miracle from God because Nisa hated him,
Yeah.
rightfully so. I mean, she was on
Oh,
Geraldo
yeah.
Rivera, all kinds of talk shows, just calling him every name in the book, and she lost her daughter, and they got so close, him and Nisa. I say Nisa, it's actually Nisa. They got so close. I've got letters behind me where she's writing him saying, Dave, please pray for my other daughter who's sick. She was sick with something. She ended up dying.
Hmm.
But please pray for her. Here is Nisa asking David, the guy that killed Stacy, to pray for Stacy's sister. So Nisa really she said that in her own words, she was eaten away with bitterness and anger. and forgiveness was the only way out of her cell. And that's really what forgiveness is. I mean, it is setting a prisoner free and finding out the prisoner is you. So Nisa forgave, and it set herself free, and she began a relationship with him. They were just about to meet, and Maury Terry kind of was involved with that and wanted to make it a televised special, and David didn't want it to be televised.
Mhm.
It kind of soured things, and then Nisa was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer,
Yeah.
and she died. So the only contact they had was through letter writing and through phone calls.
Wow. All right. Now, Michael, before this project, did you have the thought of meeting with any of the victims or the families of the victims before you interacted with David?
No, Carl Denaro. One day I just noticed that he was following me on social media.
Hmm.
Someone must have told him that I was doing this particular project, and I reached out to him. I initiated the contact
Okay.
after I saw he followed me. I thought, wow, that's interesting. Carl Denaro's following me. I mean, I was putting on social media because understand I'm writing a book. I'm
Right.
going to publish it. I've got to build up a
Absolutely.
following, right?
Sure.
So I'm on social media talking about, and plus my social media page already over the last 15 years has been all about mental health. So it just ties right into who I am and my mission. And Carl hears through the grapevine about me and what I'm doing, follows me. I send him a message. Said, Carl, I'm flattered that you're following me. Love to go to dinner with you. We meet for dinner in Queens, get to know each other. Great guy, very gentle, humble, wise. I have nothing good but good to say about him. And then at some point, David says, I want to meet with him. I want to meet
Okay.
with Carl, and I want to just tell him what happened.
Okay.
And that's when we met.
Now, I have a Cops and Writers Facebook group, and I put out that, we were going to be speaking. There's a couple of questions from there. So Mike Tuggle, it's more of a statement. He says, I'm reminded of Nietzsche's warning about staring into the abyss. And Miriam Hasham, I'm guessing I'm probably butchering her last name, I hope not. I've always been curious about how serial killers in prison interact with other prisoners. How do they get on with the general prison population, or are they in a separate part of the prison?
No, he's in the general public,
Okay.
general population, general public. He's in the general population. He's not in isolation. He's not, sequestered in any way, like maybe a Mark David Chapman. I know he's still isolated from the rest of the population. David is part of general population. He has the respect of lots of the inmates. They actually call him Pastor Dave.
Hmm.
Um, he has a lot of the young men that are looking for faith turn to him. David has Bible studies with these young men once a week. And he's pretty fatherly, if you want to look for an adjective, to some of these inmates.
Okay. Do they
He's been there
find?
sorry.
No,
I was
go
gonna say
ahead.
he's been there so long, and then guys go upstate and they're like, oh wow, it's almost for them meeting a celebrity in jail, believe it or not.
Yeah, I could see that.
Believe it or not, the young people don't. I asked him that question before.
Yeah.
He said, Mike, he said, believe it or not, a lot of the young people don't even know.
No, no, but I mean like 20 years
Oh,
ago.
sure.
Right.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Definitely.
Absolutely.
You
Do
know,
they?
he definitely had his fans, so to speak.
Then she asked, do they find camaraderie with other serial killers, serial or mass killers, because they have shared experience, or do they avoid each other?
No, David is not of that ilk. I'm sure some are, but
Okay.
not David. I mean, I dealt with two other ones that were definitely psychopathic through and through, and even used religion in their speech to me. But after being with them enough times, I was able to kind of see through it. So, for those that say, "Well, how do you know David's not manipulating you?" This is not my first rodeo. I'm trained in this area. Uh, I've sat with him long enough. I've already ruled out two others.
Hmm.
So I tell you, if I thought he was a fraud,
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
he's perfect. He's not perfect,
Yeah.
but any blemish, you find in his character, he's pretty transparent about it.
Okay.
And that's more than I can say for most people in free society.
Sure.
So, he's an imperfect man. Sure he is.
Yeah.
But I'd say he's pretty legitimate in his faith, in the practice of his faith.
Interesting. Now, does this, and she continues, does the structure of prison life bring them a kind of peace or settling down that maybe they could never find in the real world, out in the freedom?
Excellent question. Very insightful. And
Yes.
yes, yeah, I mean, there's a structure and a routine that I think has been very useful in him finding solace and being restored to sanity. Apart from that structure and routine, I don't know. I mean, that routine has been really good for him. David always did well with structure and routine. Even in elementary school, when he had a vice principal really take a liking to him in third, fourth grade, when he was a real rascal in class, and teachers would put his desk in the middle of the class and say, "This is where the bad boys sit." Because, back then, the 50s, the Bronx. But he had a vice principal that took a liking to him. She was there for a brief period of time, and she really put some structure to him and made him a hall monitor. And he started to really flourish in the structure.
Hmm.
But outside structure and routine, I don't know what would become of him. I know it's been good for him.
Okay, great. All right, and she also thanks us for all of this. So let's start wrapping this up. Uh, what's next for you, Michael?
Well, right now, I teach at two colleges. I do that Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, psychology courses. One of the colleges is a Christian college, the other one is a secular. And then on weekends, pretty much every weekend this year, with the exception of three, I speak in churches, rehabs, schools, prisons on mental health subjects. I'm pretty booked up there. I usually bring my books with me at these speaking venues. It's been one of the ways that I sell books and get the word out there and David's story out there. Um, that keeps me busy. I don't really know what the next project is yet.
Okay.
I've got the book in the hands of some pretty influential people in culture. We'll see where it takes me. I score high on openness when it comes to personality traits, so I'm open. Um, I also have another inmate that's reading the book. I don't want to say his name just yet, but if I said his name, most people would know. uh, Possibility of me doing the same thing with that person. I mean, I wouldn't sit down and do this again unless the person was candid, sincere in their desire to see change. I'm not some serial killer fanboy looking to tell, some glorious story about crimes, glorifying crimes. That's not who I
Right.
am. Anybody that knows me knows that that's not my deal. But if it was somebody that was wanting to make a difference and help those that are at the cusp of destruction in our culture, I mean, just in absolute darkness in their heads, then I could partner with that person.
Okay. Now, Vic, do you have anything final for us? Any stories or anything regarding David?
Just a couple of quick ones.
Sure.
Early in my career, I had a narcotic seizure. In the old days, the NYPD's lab was on the top, one of the top floors of the police academy. So you'd get off the elevator. To your left was the lab. To the right was ballistics. So I drop it off with a supervisor, and we come back into the hallway, and we're waiting for the elevator. And there's a display case on the wall, and it looked like something you would make in a shop class. It wasn't professionally done, but it was behind glass. And I'm looking, and there's a Thompson machine gun, and there's a couple of little derringers there. And then staring right in front of me is David Berkowitz's Charter Arms Bulldog mounted on the wall. And I'm saying to myself, what, no one would know this is here. It's
Right.
like it's just like, just to see something that bizarre just sitting there. They had it mounted behind glass, and then to the right of it was the gun that killed John Lennon.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, the NYPD. I don't know what happened to these things now, because they had since moved the lab out to Queens. It might be out there, but it was just one of those things that you see. Another time, I had to pick up someone's rap sheets. Nowadays, you can just log online and pull a triple I up, but back then you had to go to One Police Plaza, and then these walls of computers that looked like something in a 1970s movie with the reels turning, and it was hot as hell in there. And I remember waiting to get some rap sheets, and they had his fingerprint card
No kidding.
mounted on the wall up there, and I'm just kind of staring at it, and he signed it, and I'm
He
just kind of looking at
signed
him like,
it.
we just get what you do. You sign the old
Yeah.
the ink cards, you'd make them sign it. But I just
Yeah.
it was just some of those things you would just get to see. And then I guess the final story about him, my friend, another detective, purchased a condo in his building years after, 10, 15 years after. And I think it was 35 Pine Street, but then you had all these ghouls coming and taking photos and stealing stuff out of the lobby.
Okay.
The condo association successfully lobbied the city of Yonkers to change the address to 42 Pine Street, but that would
Oh.
confuse the mailman. And my friend's mail, he often had to go across the street to get it. And when I was a teenager, so you're talking, when did I join the NYPD? 87. So 84, 85, right out of high school, we thought we were going to be badasses. And we would go up to Untermeyer Park and look around. And I could definitely see they had like little underground caves there and stuff. And I could definitely see where you could see a bunch of teenage boys up to no good starting fires and stuff down there. But that's my take of rubbing elbows with David Berkowitz.
Okay. So, Michael, if somebody wants to learn more about you and your books and your work, where do they go?
A very active presence on Facebook. You can look up Mike Caparelli. You'll get daily, probably a few times a day, teachings on mental health, promotions of wherever I'm at, what I'm doing. You can go on Amazon to buy the book, Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz. You can get it in paperback. You can get it in Spanish. You can get it the Kindle version. You can go on Barnes and Noble. They have it there on their website. And then my own website is called Unmuted, UNMUTED, the name of the nonprofit that I founded, unmuted.app, app, and you'll get a little bit of insight on my nonprofit that is relating to mental health from a faith-based perspective. And yeah, so Facebook, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and the web.
Now, this unmuted.app, are there links for the book and anything else?
Yeah, there's a store on
Okay.
the website where all
Perfect.
5 books that I've written.
I will throw that in the show notes so
Thank you.
people can go to that. Vic, if they want to find out about you and all of your books, where do they go?
Just go to Amazon, type in my name, Vic Ferrari, like the car, and where you can preview all my behind the scenes NYPD books for free, and check out my podcast, NYPD Through the Looking Glass.
All right. I think we will exit here. Michael, thank you so much for being on the show today. And Vic, of course, thank you for being on the show again. I truly
this was
appreciate
great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Patrick. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Most definitely. Lots of fun in getting to know you guys. Thank you.